All right, the last two sections here will deal with Manifest Destiny and the Gold Rush, and then the Monroe Doctrine. California, which belonged to Mexico prior to the war, was at least 3 arduous months' travel from the nearest American settlements. There were some sparse settlements in the Sacramento Valley, and missionaries made the trip occasionally. But the fertile farmland of Oregon, like the black dirt lands of the Mississippi River Valley, attracted far more settlers than California. Dramatized stories of Indian attacks really filled migrants with a sense of foreboding. Although, for quiz purposes, you do need to know that most settlers encountered absolutely no violence and often no Indians at all. Slow progress, disease, human and oxen starvation, poor trails, terrible geographic preparations, lack of guidebooks, threatening wildlife, vagaries of weather, and general confusion were more often formidable and frequent than Indian attacks. Despite the harshness of the journey, by 1848, approximately 20,000 Americans were living west of the Rockies, with about 3/4 of that number in Oregon. Many who moved nurtured a romantic vision of life, attracting more Americans who sought more than just agricultural life and familial responsibilities. The rugged individualism and military prowess of the West, encapsulated for some by service in the Mexican War, drew a growing new breed west to the Sierra Nevada to meet with the Californians already there, a breed of migrants different from the modest agricultural communities of the near West. If the great draw of the West served as Manifest Destiny's kindling, then the discovery of gold in California was the spark that set the fire ablaze. Most Western settlers sought land ownership, but the lure of getting rich quick drew young single men, with some women, to gold towns throughout the West. These adventurers and fortune seekers then served as magnets for the arrival of others, providing services associated with the gold rush. Towns and cities grew rapidly throughout the West, notably San Francisco, whose population grew from about 500 in 1848 to almost 50,000 by 1853. Lawlessness, predictable failure of most fortune seekers, racial conflicts, and the slavery question all threatened Manifest Destiny's promises. On January 24th of 1848, James W. Marshall, a contractor hired by John Sutter, discovered gold on Sutter's sawmill land in the Sacramento Valley area of the California Territory. Throughout the 1850s, California's beseeched Congress for a transcontinental railroad to provide service for both passengers and goods from the Midwest to the East Coast. The potential economic benefits for communities along proposed railroads made the debate over the route really kind of out of control. Growing dissent about slavery issue also heightened tensions. The great influx of diverse people clashed in a combative and aggrandized atmosphere of individualistic pursuit of fortune. Linguistic, cultural, economic, and racial conflict roiled both urban and rural areas. By the end of the 1850s, Chinese and Mexican immigrants made up 1/5 of mining populations in California. The ethnic patchwork of these frontier towns belied a clearly defined socio-economic arrangement that saw whites on top as landowners and managers, poor whites and ethnic minorities working in the mines and assorted jobs. The competition for land, resources, and riches furthered individual and collective abuses, particularly against Indians and older Mexican communities. California's towns, as well as those dotting the landscape throughout the West, such as Tombstone, Arizona, struggled to balance security with economic development and the protection of civil rights and liberties. In Section 6, we'll deal with the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny. The expansion of influence and territory off the continent became an important corollary to Western expansion. The U.S. government sought to keep European countries out of the Western Hemisphere and applied the principles of Manifest Destiny to the rest of the hemisphere. As Secretary of State for President James Monroe, John Quincy Adams held the responsibility for the satisfactory resolution of ongoing border disputes between the United States, England, Spain, and Russia. And for quiz purposes, you need to know that Adams' view of American foreign policy was put into clearest practice in the Monroe Doctrine, which he had a great influence in crafting. Increasingly aggressive incursions from Russia in the West, ongoing border disputes with the British and Canada, the remote possibility of Spanish reconquest of South America, and the British abolitionism in the Caribbean all triggered an American response. In a speech before the U.S. House of Representatives on July 4th of 1821, Secretary of State Adams acknowledged the American need for a robust foreign policy that simultaneously protected and encouraged the nation's growing and increasingly dynamic economy. Adams' great fear was not territorial loss. He had no doubt that Russian and British interest in North America could be stopped. Adams held no reason to antagonize the Russians with grand pronouncements, nor was he generally called upon to do so. He enjoyed a good relationship with the Russian ambassador and stewarded through Congress most favorable trade status for the Russians in 1824. But for quiz purposes, you need to know that Adams really worried about the ability of the United States to compete commercially with the British in Latin America and in the Caribbean. This concern deepened with the valid concern that America's chief Latin American trading partners, Cuba, dangled perilously close to the outstretched British claws. Cabinet debates surrounding establishment of the Monroe Doctrine and geopolitical events in the Caribbean focused attention on the part of the world as key to the future defense of U.S. military and commercial interests, the main threat to those interests being the British. Expansion of economic opportunity and protection from foreign pressures became the overriding goals of U.S. foreign policy. But despite a philosophical confidence presented in the Monroe administration's decree, the reality of limited military power kept the Monroe Doctrine as an aspirational assertion. Bitter disagreements over the expansion of slavery into new lands, won from Mexico, began even before the war ended. Many northern businessmen and southern slave owners supported the idea of expanding slavery into the Caribbean as a useful alternative to continental expansion, since slavery already existed in those areas. Some were critical of these attempts, seeing them as evidence of a growing slave power conspiracy. Many others supported attempts at expansion, like those previously seen in eastern Florida, even if these attempts were not exactly legal. Filibustering, as it was called, involved privately financed schemes directed at capturing and occupying foreign territory without the approval of the U.S. government. Filibustering took greatest hold in the imaginations of Americans as they looked towards Cuba. Fears of racialized revolution in Cuba, as had happened in Haiti and Florida before it, as well as the presence of an aggressive British abolitionist influence in the Caribbean, energized the movement to annex Cuba and encouraged filibustering as expedient alternatives to lethargic official negotiations. Despite filibustering's seemingly chaotic planning and destabilizing repercussions, those intellectually and economically guided the effort imagined a willing and receptive Cuban population and expected an agreeable American business class. In Cuba, Manifest Destiny for the first time sought territory off the continent and hoped to put a unique spin on the story of success in Mexico. Yet the annexation of Cuba, despite great popularity and some military attempts led by Narciso Lopez, a Cuban dissident, never succeeded. Other filibustering expeditions were launched elsewhere, including two by William Walker, a former American soldier. Walker seized portions of the Baja Peninsula in Mexico and then later took power and established a slaving regime in Nicaragua. Eventually, Walker was executed in Honduras. These missions violated the laws of the United States, but wealthy Americans financed various filibusters, and less wealthy adventurers were all too happy to sign up. Filibustering enjoyed its brief popularity in the late 1850s, at which point slavery and concerns over secession became really the major issues. By the opening of the Civil War, most saw filibustering as simple attempts to steal territory and nothing else. And this brings us to an end of Chapter 12.